I come from a military background. If I have learned one thing from my family about service and conflict, it's that though duty and sacrifice are common themes, equally important, especially for those left to grieve, are the themes of loss and the search for meaning in that loss. So in recognition of Remembrance Day, I thought I would tell a story that weaves together my own experience with the recent loss of a friend, our mutual love of fly fishing, and how passages from the book A River Runs Through It by Norman Maclean have helped me better come to terms with this loss. So A River Runs Through It is an autobiographical story set in the mountains and rivers of Montana during the 1930s and the 1940s. It's a story about two sons of a stern minister, one reserved, one rebellious, both growing up in rural Montana and devoted to fly fishing. Norman Maclean, the author of the book, is one of the two sons. In the story, Norman Maclean's brother Paul, a troubled individual who suffers from alcoholism and gambling, is found beaten to death outside a bar. Paul is also the favorite son and a beautiful fly fisherman. A River Runs Through It is essentially a story about not being able to help when a person you love may be lost. It is the truest story I have ever read. It might be the best written. And so now for my story. My first trip to Nova Scotia was for my job interview here at Acadia. It was late spring, it was 1994, and I had to stay in Wolfville for 5 days due to flight scheduling. They used to have that. And so I brought my fly rod, some hip waders, and a few flies. The day after my interview, I went to the Gaspereau River looking for a place to fish. I stopped at Benjamin Bridge, now the winery, and started fishing. I was fairly successful and caught and released 5 or 6 small trout, or so I thought. After about 15 minutes and a few more bites, I noticed a fellow watching me from the bridge. At first, I thought it was a fisheries officer, which wouldn't be good. But he was not, so I kept fishing somewhat self-consciously. After a bit, I caught another small fish on a dry fly. The fellow on the bridge asked me what I caught. I said it was a brook trout. He quickly made his way down to the stream, examined the fish, which I was keeping cool in the water, and asked me again if I knew what type of fish I had caught. I found this kind of odd, but sensing I was a bit out of my element, this time I said I was not sure, and the fellow proceeded to tell me that I'd caught a nice-sized salmon parr. He laughed and said we'd better get it off the hook and back into the stream before we got in trouble, as I was fishing in a restricted zone and had caught a restricted fish. Naturally, I was kind of embarrassed, quickly released the fish, and the two of us walked down the stream, sat on the bank, and talked for a while. He complimented me on the way I handled the fish, as he had been watching me without me knowing for some time. He said something to me that I've never forgotten. He said, "It's easy to do the right thing when you have an audience. The hard thing is doing it when nobody is looking." And I believe that's actually taken from C.S. Lewis, of all people. With that, he wished me good luck, told me I should check out the halfway river up the road, and left me with a present of a little collection of his own flies. This fellow obviously had his wits about him, and he did not suffer fools. But all in all, it was a chance meeting with someone interesting and insightful, a nice, gentle conversation. I never asked him his name. So that chance meeting helped me make my decision. I accepted the job offer from Acadia. It was about a year later that I met the fellow on the bridge again, and his name was Mike Berlinski. He's a professor, or was a professor in biology, in the biology department at Acadia. And when I first met him, a year later, he remembered me immediately and asked me how the salmon fishing was going. Now, my friendship with Mike developed kind of gradually. Over the years, we co-supervised some students, and we'd occasionally go fly fishing together. It was during these trips that we would sometimes talk about Norman Maclean's book, A River Runs Through It. We both knew the book pretty well. And as Norman Maclean used fly fishing as both a backdrop to and a metaphor for life's struggles, we would occasionally, and sometimes without really knowing it, use quotes from the book when talking about things that were bothering us. Difficult colleagues, family challenges, and the such. Mike reminded me very strongly of Norman Maclean's father in the book, The Preacher. And I quote from the book. So this is a quote. As a Scot and a Presbyterian, my father believed that man by nature was a mess and had fallen from an original state of grace. In our family, there was no clear line between religion and fly fishing. We lived at the junction of the great trout rivers in western Montana, and our father was a Presbyterian minister and a fly fisherman who tied his own flies and taught others. He told us about Christ's disciples being fishermen, and we were left to assume, as my brother and I did, that all first-class fishermen on the Sea of Galilee were fly fishermen, and that John, the favorite, was a dry fly fisherman. As time passed, Mike and I spent more time fishing, especially when I introduced him to the main branch of the Avon River above Benjamin Mill on the Mines Road. A lovely stretch of water that reminded me of my days fishing in the Rocky Mountain foothills when I was at the University of Calgary. Mike was a careful fisherman, never disturbing the water, often watching more than fishing. He tied beautiful flies. He was strong, compact, and very purposeful in the way that he fished. The last time we fished together was a beautiful early summer day in 2014. It was cool with a light breeze, and we headed up the river to where the channel was deeply inset, shielding the water from the sun and keeping it cool. I remember that on that day, Mike caught trout where I had been unsuccessful. I enjoyed sitting on the bank watching him carefully fish over a small pool. But though Mike and I enjoyed each other's company and would linger on the river as long as time and commitments would allow our relationship was pretty simple. We fished together, and that was about it. In the fall of 2014, Mike took ill. I was completely unaware of this at first, and when I did find out, it was clear that Mike, being a very private person, did not want visitors. Knowing Mike, or so I thought, and finding this completely in character, I hoped to myself that he would get well. I looked forward to seeing him once or twice over the winter, and very much looked forward to picking up where we had left off on the Avon River in the spring. I was upset, or perhaps unsettled is a better word, but also wanted to be respectful. Still, I had a strong feeling that I should help, but I did not know how. Again, from the book A River Runs Through It. I knew there were others like me who had brothers they did not understand but wanted to help. We are probably those referred to as our brother's keepers, possessed of one of the oldest and possibly one of the most futile and certainly one of the most haunting instincts. It will not let us go. Mike did not get better. It was while I was in British Columbia this spring that I heard Mike was gravely ill, and shortly after that he had died. I was shocked and confused. To be honest, I did not know what to think. For a month or so, I was anchored firmly in some sort of emotional purgatory, understanding just enough to stay confused and uncertain, yet not enough to move forward to grace. I wondered what, if anything, I should do. But in July, I was unexpectedly asked to say a few words at his memorial service at his house. I knew there were many others that knew Mike much better than I did. But I was told that this was something Mike had wanted. This made me quite uneasy. I want you to remember those words I heard years ago in 1994 from Mike. It's easy to do the right thing when you have an audience. The hard thing is doing it when nobody is looking. These were Mike's words, they weren't mine. Words that I've often thought of, but equally as often failed to carry out. I was not sure what I could say that would both honor Mike's memory and also reflect our relationship, a relationship that I did not understand. So in looking for words to say about Mike, I turned to the book that Mike and I had both loved. And again, I quote from Norman Maclean and the book A River Runs Through It. In this instance, the father is talking at the funeral for his youngest son, Paul. And the father says, "Each one of us here today will at one time in our lives look upon a loved one who is in need and ask the same question. We are willing to help, Lord, but what, if anything, is needed? For it is true we can seldom help those closest to us. Either we don't know what part of ourselves to give, or more often than not, the part we have to give is not wanted. And so it is those we live with and should know who elude us. But we can still love them. We can love completely without completely understanding." And so it was with Mike and me. I will use the word like because I know that the other word is not one Mike would have wanted me to use. Mike and I liked each other completely without completely understanding each other. And that should be enough. I suspect for Mike it was. I will leave you with one last quote from Norman Maclean's book. Perhaps it will help explain why the story I have told you is so important to me. In this quote, the surviving brother, Norman Maclean, who has since become a professor of English at the University of Chicago, relates to the reader a conversation he had with his father, the preacher, sometime after the funeral for Paul. "You like to tell true stories, don't you?" my father asked. And I answered, "Yes, I like to tell stories that are true." Then he asked, "After you have finished your true stories sometime, why don't you make up a story and the people to go with it? Only then will you understand what happened and why." This story that I have told you is my attempt to understand what happened. It is my story that is true. And stories that are true are more often more like rivers than books.